च dharmasya sarvadharmasvarupini avataravarišthaya Ramakrishnaya te namaha. So I just want, before continuing this session, want to give some kind of an informal recapitulation. We are discussing the philosophical systems in Buddhist tradition. And I mentioned earlier, there are two main streams in Buddhist religion and also Buddhist philosophy. One is Hinayana, the more traditional, the orthodox system of philosophy, which primarily is based on the teachings of the Tripitakas, which are the Pali canonical scriptures written in Pali language, which embodied the original teachings of Buddha, which are recorded a few years after Buddha's passing away in the first Buddhist council. And in that Buddhist council, the monks who had already learned from Buddha and also laity, they remembered and then they recorded in Pali script all the teachings, and this canonical tradition came to be known as Tripitakas, means three baskets, three traditions, three collections of Buddha's original teachings. That is Sutta Pitaka, Vinaya Pitaka, and Abhidhamma Pitaka. Now, from around 2nd century BC onwards, and we have to keep in mind Buddha must have passed away around 480 BC. There are different views among historians with regard to the exact date of Buddha's passing away, but that is not very important in this context. So, from 2nd century BC onwards, almost up to around 7th century AD, for almost 900 years, a number of philosophical traditions emerged in Buddhist tradition. In the Hinayana tradition, there were two views, two schools, Sautrantika and Vaibhashika. Sautrantika school is sometimes frequently referred to in English representationism, in the sense because they believed that external objects do exist independent of mind, and they can be only inferred. So Bahya Anumeyavadinaha, they came to be known as Bahya Anumeyavad. Anumana means inference. So they believe in the reality of external objects outside the mind. So that is an important point. The reality of external objects outside of human mind. Extra-mental objects do exist, but they can only be inferred. And we cannot directly contact them or cognize them through direct perception. It is called pratyaksha. We can only infer. This is the view. So this is called a kind of realism, equals Sautrantika. And then there was another school which is slightly older, the Vaibhashikas. They believed that external objects do exist outside of mind, and they can be directly perceived. So that is their view. Now we will slowly discuss this subject. I want to give a little background of this philosophical evolution. Now, all these ideas belong to one concept, one central teaching, that is, objects do exist outside of human mind. So they came to be known as Sarvastivadinaha. Sarvam asti iti vadinaha means they believe that external objects do exist. So you will understand its significance only when we compare these two schools with the other two schools belonging to Mahayana system, which is Shunyavada and Vijnanavada, that we already discussed. Shunyavada we already discussed. According to Mahayana system, which is called the idealistic school, they believe that external objects do not exist outside of mind. Among the Yogacara or Vijnanavadins believed the external objects do not exist, but there is an internal awareness. So they came to be known as Vijnanavadi. So you may have heard of this, Vijnana. Vijnana means speculation, cognition, awareness. Awareness is there, but the objects that we are aware of do not exist. You understand the real significance of this philosophical system only when we read Shankaracharya's objections to this view. For example, to give an example, they believed in what is called Sahobalambhavada. Sahobalambha means the Yogacara philosophers teach that awareness and objects that we are aware of, they come into existence simultaneously. So Sahobalambha. So at the same time, they do not have any real existence, external objects. But cognition, awareness does exist. So they are called Vijnanavadins. And they also emphasize this practice of yoga. So the school also came to be known as Yogacara. So Yogacara and Vijnanavada, they are the same. Asanga and Vasubandhu, they are two brothers. They are let us say, they can be called the co-founders of the Yogacara system, which is called Vijnanavada. It came to be known as Vijnanavada because they gave importance to awareness, Vijnana. They also believed that this experience can be achieved only through certain spiritual disciplines, which must have included most probably the teachings of Patanjali Yoga Sutras. So it came to be known as Yogacara also. So the Bible of this Yogacara Vijnanavada system is called Yogacara Bhumi. Yogacara Bhumi Shastram, something called. The author is Asanga. His brother Vasubandhu together developed this system. And according to many historians, both were teachers in Nalanda University. For those of you who know, historically they are important. If you go to Google today, you can see the government of India in a way have tried to revive this university, which is totally destroyed. Libraries burned, Buddhist monks slaughtered, put to genocide by Muslim invaders under Muhammad Bakhtiyar Khilji, who later went all the way to Bengal also. He killed and destroyed universities and dynasties, and Muhammad Bakhtiyar Khilji. But that Nalanda University, that's a holy place where Huang Sang came, the great Buddhist pilgrims came, Fakhiyan and others came from different periods. Now, just I'm giving a background. Now, the Vijnanavada and Shunyavada. You know, we already studied Shunyavada more or less. We'll continue the discussion today also. Certain other aspects of Shunyavada. Shunyavada was developed by Nagarjuna. More or less, they were contemporaries, these Asanga and Vasubandhu and Nagarjuna. Or if at all, there may be slight variation, there may be just maybe a gap of 50, 60 years. They were more or less contemporaries. Nagarjuna, who is the founder of Shunyavada, and also Asanga and Vasubandhu, who were the founders of Yogacara or Vijnanavada. Now these two schools came to be known as idealistic schools, Shunyavada and Vijnanavada. In contrast to this, what we discussed earlier, the two schools that belong to Hinayana tradition, which considered the Pali canon as the fundamental source of learning, fundamental source of authority. They came to be known as Sarvastivadins, because they believed, as I mentioned earlier, in the reality of objects existing outside of human mind. Now, among them, the first school was Vaibhashika. They believed that external objects do exist, and these external objects could be perceived directly by using our senses of perception and mind. So they came to be known as Bahya Pratyakshavadim. So they believed that external objects which exist outside of human mind may be perceived or cognized. And one of the early writers belonging to this Vaibhashika school of Sarvastivadi, is called Katyayini Putra, and he wrote a well-known book, Jnana Prasthana. These are all Sanskrit books. So you have to remember the transition from Pali canon into Sanskrit canon. So today, if you get a general idea of the books existing in Buddhist tradition, the vast majority of them are Sanskrit books, but some of them were translated into Chinese language by great pilgrims like Yuan Sang. This is pronounced differently in the language, but this is the only pronunciation that I can think of. Yuan Sang, called. So some of them took hundreds of scriptures, original Sanskrit books from Nalanda University, and they were translated into Tibetan and Chinese languages. And many of the original Sanskrit books were recovered, reconstructed with the help of the ancient Sanskrit translations. The second school of Sarvastivadi is called Sutrantika, Sarvastivadi, Sarvam Asti Iti Vadinaha, Sarvastivadinaha. In Pali, they call it Sabbam Atti, means Sabbam means Sarvam, everything exists, Atti in Pali. And that second school is called Sautrantika. And that is sometimes called representationism because they believe that these external objects cannot be directly perceived through pratyaksha pramana, direct perception. They can only be inferred. So they came to be known as Bahya Anumeyavadinaha. But one point is very clear, that is, they did believe in the extra-mental existence of the phenomenal world. This is an important point, remember. Now, to understand these philosophical ideas, I shall give just a few examples how non-Buddhists approach these ideas. Now, for example, let's say the Buddhists believe that an entity, Vastu, and Vastu Vijnanam, cognition or awareness of that object. Vastu means an object. Vijnana means awareness, cognition. So, for example, in both Buddhist and Hindu Vedantic tradition, they use these examples. They take ghata, pada. Ghata means a pot. Pada means a cloth. So you can find such terms in the original book. So they believe, for example, a pot comes into existence and pot awareness also comes into existence simultaneously. Now, Advaitins did not accept this. Technically, it is called Saho Balambha Niyamaka. Advaitins will tell you, if external objects are unreal, then you cannot say the awareness of that object can be real. Vijnanavadins believe in the reality of awareness. That is called Vijnana, means awareness, cognition, cognitive faculty. So they believed that if external objects are unreal, then how can the awareness of external objects be real? The knowledge of pot is real, but the pot itself is unreal. If you later on, we will discuss this, in George Berkeley. He was a theologian, he was a priest, he had his own ideas. Of course, he tried to explain this in the context of Christian theology, the subjective idealism. So, But Advaitin said, if objects are real, then the awareness of objects cannot be real. So because they believed the internal awareness without an object that you are aware of. Another point which they raised in this context, which they used also to Advaitins, and we are talking about Advaitins. How Advaitins, Shankaracharya in his commentaries. For example, he asked a question, very similar. He put this question to Shunyavadins. You can find maybe in this Bhashya, in this Brahma Sutra Bhashya, there are portions where the commentator raises this question. I can just, well, if you are interested, maybe it's a good idea to read those wonderful statements. He says, so Bhashyakara says, if external objects are unreal, then how is it that we are able to remember them? Now, you have seen an object sometime in the past, and you remember that today. So there should be somebody who has seen in the past, and the same person should be existing now. Otherwise, how do you explain memory? To justify memory, human memory, you should admit the same subject must have experienced something in the past, and the same person, the same subject, is now remembering that. Thus, there is a bridge between the past and the present. Also, a bridge between the dream and waking state. So, there should be somebody who experiences something in the past 10 years ago and later remembers 10 years later. So, if objects are unreal, and the unreality of objects is a common doctrine tenet for Shunyavadins and also Vijnanavadins, and also generally speaking, they believe in the absence of anything that is permanent. Now, external objects do have an existence, but it's only a relative existence. It's not permanent in the absolute sense, but it is permanent in the relative sense. That's why we are able to remember. So you can find all these discussions in the coming sessions. Again, Advaitins will ask you the question. If Ghatajnana and Patajnana can be the same, but it's not so. So the point is, suppose the Vijnanavadin subjective idealist will tell you that only awareness is there. The object that we are aware of is non-existent. So in that case, awareness is common. So then how do you explain the difference between your awareness of a pot that you have seen and the awareness of some tree that you have seen? There are so many things that we are aware of. If awareness is the only reality and the objects that we are aware of are totally non-existent, then this awareness should be uniform, the same, totally identical, but that's not found to be the truth in our real experience. So you can find all these differences. So we are now giving an example of these four schools of Buddhist philosophical systems. But you have to keep in mind, surprisingly, there are striking similarities between some of the well-known schools of Shunyavada and Vijnanavada and some of the ancient Greek philosophers, Pyrrho, Plotinus, and some of the modern philosophers like Kant and others are examples. But I mostly want to focus on the earlier Greek philosophers, because many later philosophers must have taken this idea from the earlier Greek philosophers. After all, Kant as the credit of reviving independent thinking in Western world after Augustine, who put a full stop, put a cap on independent thinking right after the Neoplatonism flourished and then almost disappeared from the speculative minds of Western thinkers till the coming of Kant. So Kant's thing in itself is frequently compared to Nagarjuna's Shunya or Advaita Brahman. But you have to remember the roots of these ideas go back to pre-Augustinian Greek thought. So one example is the earliest one, the Pyrrho. He must have accompanied Alexander the Great during his invasions to India, 327 or 328 BC. That's the time given Alexander's invasion. So Pyrrho, obviously he was influenced by Buddhist philosophical traditions. And his concept of, we are coming to that, so we will discuss a few things about Pyrrho. So Pyrrhonism it is called, which has many areas of similarities with Nagarjuna's Madhyamika school. For example, the idea of giving up, rejecting all dogmatic views, what you call in search for peace. That's a purpose in Pyrrho's speculative system. Peace, kind of Pyrrhonism. The nirvana is the supreme goal in Nagarjuna's Shunya tradition, Shunyavada. Pyrrho believed that we should not accept any of the fixed judgments or dogmatic theories, very similar to Nagarjuna's rejection of the Chaturskodi. And again, another maybe an earlier, much earlier philosopher, pre-Socrates philosopher, his name is Parmenides is called. He believed in what he called being. So frequently one will find, but again you should remember they are not identical. Absolutely not. Nagarjuna gives much more importance to dialectical reasoning than any of the early Greek philosophers. So his exploration of being and non-being is being compared to Nagarjuna's dialectical argument. So being is Shunya, non-being is the dependent origination that you find in all the schools of Buddhism. So these are some of the striking similarities that you find. Again, Nagarjuna, as I mentioned, Nagarjuna's Chaturskodi, we already discussed earlier. Asti, Nasti, Asti Nasti, and Nasti, Nasti Nasti. So that is more or less same in Gaudapada's Mandukya and also Plotinus, another example. Plotinus believed that there is one absolute reality and you have to transcend all categories to experience that absolute reality. They go beyond all categories of being and non-being, and there's ultimate source, the one ultimate source that is beyond all attributes. It is beyond ideas of creation. Nagarjuna Shunya again, he rejects the absolute existence of the phenomenal world, and he doesn't even say definitely that Shunya is Shunya. So he says Shunya or Ashunya, both are equally to be transcended to really understand Shunya. I mean, an extreme form of Chaturskodi, or rejecting all possible prepositions that you find in Nagarjuna. Again, for Nagarjuna it is Shunya, but for Plotinus it is the one supreme reality, the one as ultimate, the perfect reality, and that is the source of everything. From that one reality, from the transcendental, perfect, absolute reality, everything in this world emanates. Nagarjuna, on the other hand, doesn't have anything to call an absolute final point of origination. He rejects even the very doctrine of origination. Just from a different perspective, of course, Nagarjuna and Gaudapada both believe in non-origination, Ajatavada, from a different perspective. Nagarjuna says nothing really exists, neither existing nor non-existing, neither combination of both, neither or the combination of the opposite of both do not exist. That is Chaduskodi Vivarjidam, Chaduskodi Vivarjidam he calls. Means it is devoid of any of the four possible prepositions. You cannot call it as existing or non-existing, or existing and non-existing, or neither existing nor non-existing. Again, Plotinus uses the metaphysical speculation to describe the one, and he says it is a source of all beauty, all charm, all blessedness. Nagarjuna uses a kind of dialectical method. So Nagarjuna's system is sometimes called a kind of destructive logic. So he reconstructs all possible conceivable ways of defining or explaining anything. And this is what is left behind even cannot be called Shunya, and that is the only absolute reality. Again, the ultimate goal of the Shunya or Shunyada according to Nagarjuna is Nirvana, going beyond this samsara, going beyond this cyclic movement of being born, living, enjoying and suffering, dying, again being reborn. This Paditya Samutpada, dependent origination, samsara. And going beyond this is the purpose of human existence. And when you practice this Ashtanga Marga, mean eightfold disciplines, and then when we reach the highest reach of Samyak Samadhi, you experience Shunya, and that can only be experienced, cannot be explained. But for Plotinus, it is a positive experience of blessedness. It's a source of beauty, goodness, all that is auspicious. Nagarjuna doesn't deny the existence of auspiciousness, goodness or beauty. But he says the absolute reality even cannot be defined as the beautiful or the good, because that will be in conflict with the idea of Chaduskodi, Vivarjidam, mean going beyond the four possible prepositions. Again, Plotinus talks about the mystical union with the one, transcending all kinds of multiplicity, to achieve the ultimate unity with that supreme one, which is the source of all beauty, all goodness, all auspiciousness. So, in fact, the great philosopher Plotinus, he was the founder of Neoplatonist movement. So, Parmenides was, of course, he lived even before Socrates. Plotinus, on the other hand, was a post-Christian philosopher. So it is said that the great clergyman, the great theologian Augustine, the 5th century theologian Augustine himself was a great scholar in Neoplatonism, but he also was in a way responsible for the gradual decay of independent thought, which was a distinctive characteristic of the golden era of early philosophical speculation in Western world. So I'm just trying to give a few important points here. Plotinus talks about a mystical reunion, and Nagarjuna talks about going beyond everything to experience nirvana. And one important characteristic of this nirvana is you transcend this cycle of samsara, going beyond everything. Nagarjuna was a believer in the total non-existence of the external world. Plotinus, on the other hand, he believed that the creation emanates from this one supreme reality, which is the source of all beauty and goodness, all existence. So anyway, these are a few interesting points. After this, we will take up the important system known as Vijnanavada. Many of the ideas of Vijnanavada and Shunyavada become crystal clear when we approach these philosophical systems from the other angle, from the Vedantic perspective. Of course, there are other, we already mentioned Pyrrho, who believed in some kind of, but though he rejected all possible dogmatism, he was a bit of a skeptic. He believed in skepticism. He believed in not going for any ultimate conclusion or judgment. So he said the world we perceive is only a copy, a reflection of a higher reality. So you can see some comparison, some similarity. Nagarjuna believed the Samvriddhi Satya, the empirical world, should be transcended. Then only we will realize Shunya, and that Shunya is eventually the realization of the inherent absence of anything that is permanent in this world. But at the same time, in Pyrrho, you don't find that level of total rejection. He only believed that the world that we see is only a copy, a reflection of a higher reality. Because he believed in the idea, in a solid philosophy of salvation, and at the same time he was not willing to come to any conclusion. So this suspension of judgment was an important characteristic of Pyrrho. And another very important similarity between Pyrrho and Nagarjuna was this tetralemma we call Chatuskodi. I mean, he also believed in tetralemma. I mean, of course, the underlying principle of Chatuskodi or tetralemma, which means rejecting all possible prepositions, not only binary prepositions, all possible prepositions are rejected when you accept this idea, tetralemma or Chatuskodi. But the underlying principle was a kind of skepticism. And when you fully get established in the skepticism, you get peace. So that's what that is idea behind. And this is what we call atraxia, we call getting some kind of inner peace and tranquility. For that, you should reject all possible conceivable judgments, not only binary judgments, but even all other conceivable prepositions. So that maybe Pyrrho is the only philosopher in Western tradition who believed in tetralemma. Okay, I think I mentioned earlier, the source, the original source of this tetralemma or Chatuskodi is found in the Upanishad literature. Not only in the Mandukya Upanishad, the seventh mantra, Nanda prakyam, na bhishprakyam, na bheda prakyam, na prakyam, na prakyam, etc. But then it is not the seer in the waking state, nor the seer in the dream state, like that, it is. So all possible prepositions are rejected. Then Shantam Shivam Chadurtham Maninde Sa Atma Sa Vijñeha. Beyond all this, there is one Atman. So when you meditate on that Atman, then you realize the source of everything, the absolute reality. So on the one hand, there is this Chatuskodi or tetralemma, rejection of all possible prepositions. Then there is a movement towards something sublime, something the original source. So both you find in the Upanishadi, Chatuskodi, but you don't find that in Nagarjuna or even Pyro. But remember, both of them rejected any kind of dogmatism. And Pyro wanted mental peace by not believing in anything through skepticism. Nagarjuna wanted to show a way to nirvana, which is also a kind of mental peace only. The two different words are used. So it's something like this, when you first get a spiritual sense, when you make sense of a philosophical idea in a spiritual fashion, then when you read, you don't feel any conflict. The problem is, in modern times, when we study the great philosophers of pre-Augustinian era, we try to understand everything based on the word meaning. I think that may not be a perfect way of understanding great philosophers. So, as I often mentioned, when in music, there are two ways of appreciating music. A great music can be appreciated by somebody who knows nothing about the musical tradition. Because the sound itself conveys the musical quality to any sensible human being, even if that person is totally ignorant of the language in which that music is composed. That's a higher music. There is a music beyond music or music behind music. Then there is another way of understanding music, by knowing the language in which it is composed, by knowing all the technical details of that composition. That is another way of appreciating music. But the higher music, a sublime form of music, will find its way into the human soul, irrespective of the knowledge of the listener, whether the person is, he knows the language in which that music is played or not. Music itself transmits its soul into the human mind and doesn't need any other channel. Like that, when the human mind is focused on this journey towards higher spiritual truth, then when you find that Pyro and Nagarjuna were approaching the same reality from two different perspectives. But if you are reading the book and analyzing the philosophy behind it, on the basis of the meaning, the textual meaning or the dictionary meaning of those words, you won't get it. Because the real philosophy is beyond the books in which it is explained. It has got a higher way of communicating. So that's the greatness of these pre-Augustinian Greek philosophers. What happened was later, theology in Western countries, theology became dominant. The theologians decided what is true, because what is written in a book allegedly coming from God, that is right, everything is absolutely false. So human speculation, our journey in search of truth, the speculative truth, has no place in the post-Augustinian philosophical tradition, Western world, till the coming of Immanuel Kant. And when he came with a huge, we call like a hammer. That's the problem. When theology becomes so dominant, rendering independent thought almost impossible, then a great philosopher will come and he will demolish all existing systems if it has anything to do with theology. So theology often gives a bad name to philosophy. That's one problem. You find, for example, if you read Nagarjuna or Vasubandhu, Chandrakirti is a commentator on Nagarjuna's Madhyamika Karika, Asanga and Vasubandhu, a great philosopher of Yogacara system. Asanga is the originator. Now the point is, they were such masterminds. They could think, they could use their intellect, their reasoning power, and speculate this higher thought. So once we take the spiritual approach, you can find a harmony, a synthesis. That's why I mentioned earlier, when you read Nagarjuna's Madhyamika Karika, and then when you read Gaudavada's Mandukya Karika, which was written maybe about 250 years after Nagarjuna, you find the same. There are many ideas which are almost identical. But this can be properly understood only from a spiritual perspective and not from a dialectical perspective. Now I am going to take up a few important subjects with regard to Shunyavada and Yogacara system based on Shankaracharya's own view. So, to remember, Shankara lived in the 8th century AD and Nagarjuna apparently in the 3rd century AD. Asanga and Vasubandhu were more or less his contemporaries, and Gaudapada in the 6th century AD and Shankara in the 8th century, and Buddha in the 6th century BC. So we have to keep in mind this the vast long period of speculative, the glory of speculative philosophy in India during that time. Now there are a few important sutras in Brahma Sutra where Shankaracharya, to give an example, just a sample, for example, he questions some of the ideas in the Yogacara system. That we are going to discuss. Now, according to Yogacara system, you have to remember, and Yogacara system, again, I mentioned to you, Asanga is the originator. Vasubandhu was his brother. Vasubandhu wrote well-known book, Vimshatika. So, Yogacara Bhumi, that is Asanga's origin. That's a most important foundational work. And his brother Vasubandhu wrote Vimshatika. Vijñapti matram evaidat asat arthavabhasanat yatha taimirigasya asat keshadi darshanam. Nothing is outside the mind. That's what he says. Vijñapti matram eva etat. Vijñapti means awareness, vijñana. Asat arthavabhasanat yatha taimirigasya asat keshadi darshanam. So somebody whose eyes are sick or maybe jaundice. So what happens? He sees everything in yellow color according to the kind of disease he has got in his eyes. Like that, only the awareness of objects is there. The objects themselves are non-existent. This is an important idea. It's fundamental. It is from Vimshatika, a well-known book by Vasubandhu. And again, according to both Asanga and Vasubandhu, according to Yogacara Bhumi or Asanga, there is no difference between the experiences, either with regard to awareness or the objects that we are aware of, between dream and waking state experiences. So, the waking state experiences, what we see with our eyes open, are as unreal as the objects that we see in dream. So there is no difference between the two experiences. Both are equally unreal. Now, how does the Advaitin approach the subject? So that's the topic now. So there's a sutra is there. The sutra is called Na Bhava Upalabdhehi. The meaning is this: external objects, what we see outside of our mind, they do have an existence. The literal meaning is they do not have non-existence. That's the literal meaning. Na bhava upalabdhehi. A sutra, it comes in the Brahma Sutra, I think maybe 20, maybe I think, second chapter, second section, the sutra number 28. This is called Adhikarana. Adhikarana means number of sutras clubbed together. A specific topic is discussed in a series of sutras. So that section is collectively called Adhikarana. So this particular section itself is called Na Abhava Adhikaranam. What it means is external objects that we see during waking state do not have non-existence, which means they do have existence. That's the meaning. They have an existence outside of the human mind. It's a refutation of yoga, Vijnanavada or Shunyavada or subjective idealism, which tells you that extra-mental objects have no existence. They exist because we perceive them. If we don't perceive them, they're as good as non-existent. Now, this is the idea behind. Now, the commentator will tell you that it cannot be true because we can see an external object in the waking state, both in their causal form and also in the effect form. See, for example, with our own eyes, we see a pot maker making a pot using clay and different instruments. So you can see slowly the clay evolving, becoming a pot, or a golden ornament becomes some other golden ornament. So this happens right in front of our eyes. So 2 hours ago, it was a heap of clay. After 2 hours, it has become a pot. It assumed a form, and we call it a different name. How can we say these are totally unreal? If they are totally unreal, then this change itself cannot take place. Again, this change in a visible form doesn't take place in dream. So, and again we can see them, we can connect with them with the senses. So, of course, they are unreal in the absolute sense, but they have a reality in the relative sense. And that reality is called empirical reality. It is called Vyavaharika Satta. This Nagarjuna calls Samvriddhi Satya. But Nagarjuna tells you that the Samvriddhi Satya itself has no existence. So the problem is always when Buddhist philosophers are not able to divide reality into the absolute, the empirical and the conceptual. So the absolute reality is there. From the absolute reality perspective, of course, dream objects and waking state objects are equally unreal. You see a waking state object, maybe you may have seen a hill, you may have seen, or a river you have seen in dream. In waking state also we see a dream or maybe a mountain. So in dream state it disappears maybe in seconds. In waking state they change and become something else. They disappear maybe in course of some millions of years. So the idea that they do change, they disappear, that is there. But there is a difference between, it's called internal difference. If you take a perspective from an empirical perspective, or if you leave behind that absolutistic perspective, paramarthika drishti, absolutistic perspective, you can see that there is a difference between the waking state and dream state. I gave the example last time, when we discussed this, somebody, maybe 100 people tried to get admission to university. You get admission only if you get 100% mark. Many tried, only one person got admission because she alone secured 100% mark. And among the others, there were those who got 5%, 0%, 99%. The one who got 99% also could not get admission. Only the one who got 100% could get admission. From the perspective of getting admission to university, there is no difference between the 99%, the person who got 99%, and the one who got 0%. But if you do not take that perspective, and let's say all the 99%, they come together and discuss. The one who got 99% mark can say, I am certainly much more brilliant than you. He can tell somebody who got only 9%, I did much better in the examination than you, who got only 9%, who got 0%. So this is called iteretara bheda, means internal difference. Between them there is a difference, but there is no difference with regard to the ultimate goal of getting university admission. From the highest absolutistic perspective, there is no difference with regard to somebody who saw something in dream and the same person who saw something in waking state. Whatever you see in waking state also will disappear maybe in millions of years. Just like whatever we see in dream will disappear in seconds or minutes. So there is difference with regard to time, space, and the kind of perception that happens. But from the highest perspective, there is no difference. So the problem is Vijnanavadins and Shunyavadins, they do not see the distinction between the empirical and the absolutistic perspective. That's one thing. But then from the highest perspective you find Shunya or Shunyada is one way of looking at Brahman. Brahman is another way of looking at Shunya. Brahman is more holistic, transcendental way of interpreting the absolute reality. Shunya gives emphasis on in the absence of anything inherently real. The absence of any kind of inherent reality is emphasized in Shunya. But in Advaita, the absolute reality which goes beyond all prepositions, all verbalizations is emphasized. Anyway, so we will discuss this little in the coming sessions. We can have interaction. Thank you. Question. Yeah.
Thank you, Maharaj.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll lead off, there being no other hands.
Yeah.
So one thing that keeps emerging is, and it's not an absolute difference between East and West, but when you discuss Neoplatonists like Plotinus, for example, and you say that there are conclusions made about the value of inference, and that what we see is, manifestations of gloriousness, but we also, in epistemological terms, are still looking at cause to effect.
Yeah.
Because when we think of the Eastern approach to epistemology, especially from the Advaitic perspective, we go from effect to cause.
Yeah.
And so it's another way of looking at inference. And I know it's not absolutely demarked as different between East and West. It's all seems to be all over the place depending on who you're looking at.
Yeah.
But inference is, in today's lecture, it just appears to be still different between East and West. That this idea of the Western philosophers still seem to be tied to the idea of going in a linear fashion from cause to effect.
Yeah, the linear approach has its problem, because anything that's linear cannot be absolute, because it has a beginning, it has an end. So if it is cyclic, in a wheel, every point is a beginning, a middle, and an end. There is no beginning, there is no end, like human life. So, and again, if you are a student of comparative philosophy, you find right from 5th century AD onwards, before that, Augustine, Constantine's declaration of Christianity, theological Christianity as a religion, as the dominant thought system of Western world. Before that, you find many of the Greek thinkers were almost like the great Indian sages. There was austerity, a kind of search for the absolute truth, and looking for something universal. See, you cannot think of anything universal if you are a theologian. But theology imprisons you within the framework of a book, a system, belief, and so on. You are not allowed to question. No, you don't get a Plotinus in a system which has no freedom to question. The Pyrrho, any of them. So, Philo, any of them. So the glory of Western thought was again the period of Neoplatonism and so the early Greek thought systems, Maybe right from this, Thales was an early pioneer, but maybe around 5th century BC up to maybe 4th century. By 4th century, of course, the golden era almost comes to an end. So, and then what happened was every attempt was made to push back to against the church and theology. So, a kind of chaotic system. So the systematic approach in search of some supreme universal truth that characterized the early Greek thinkers, that you don't find during from 8th century AD onwards. And, demolishing all the existing belief systems, push back against theology. That's a...
Thank you, Maharaj.
Yes, thank you.
Two hands up, Karen and then David. Go ahead, Karen.
Pranav Swamiji.
Yeah.
So, Swamiji, you mentioned the absolute, the empirical, and was it the relative, the three perspectives?
Yeah.
Okay. So can you discuss the difference between the empirical and the relative a little bit?
Oh, yeah. Empirical and relative are the same.
Oh.
Empirical and relative are the same. Phenomenal.
Okay.
Yeah. Because in Vedantic tradition, what we call Vyavaharika, or the empirical, the relative, or in Buddhist tradition, the Samvriti, means the relative, the empirical, they're the same. Nagarjuna system, the absolute is called Shunya, but the word and its English translation creates a lot of confusion. That's why I referred to and discussed the original statements from Madhyamika Karika, where Nagarjuna says, it is neither Shunyam nor Ashunyam. It is neither Shunya nor non-Shunya, he says. So, why does he use these apparently paradoxical terms? To emphasize that it's beyond any kind of verbalization, description, or definition. So,
thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. David, please.
Hello, Swami.
Yeah.
I actually have several questions, but in Vedanta, which as the Ramakrishna order teaches it, the Holy Mother, for instance, talks about the practice of purifying the mind.
Yeah.
So your example of 99% versus 0% and 100% in Vedanta seems that the person or 99 needs to purify themselves.
Yeah.
Is that not? Is that concept of purification of the mind not in Buddhism?
Yes, absolutely. Because, see, there are many advanced souls who may have reached 99%, like Mark, you say, mental purity through karma yoga, bhakti, and so on. But so long as the idea of realizing the ultimate is concerned, they have still traveled some distance, not the whole distance. They have traveled a lot of distance, quite a lot of distance. So this is an important point. So every single act of compassion, unselfishness, sanctity will make our mind all the more ready, more and more ready to realize the supreme truth. Even to understand higher speculative philosophy, in Buddhism, for example, one should not get away with the impression that Nagarjuna was an anarchist. No, absolutely no. Because these greats, they were all great sages, living very pure life, very ascetic, doing a lot of meditation. So they were all great sages. But then when you translate Nagarjuna's system into a simple English, if it is simple English translation, one may conclude that he was some kind of an anarchist. Madhyamika Kariga, with the verbal translation can be terribly misleading, but it's a magnificent philosophical spiritual classic. He is trying to emphasize the idea that the absolute reality is beyond any kind of verbalization, any kind of conceptualizations, any kind of philosophical discussions. That's what he is emphasizing. But the way it is done is very dialectical. It's so dialectical. We have to remember the human mind has lost a lot of these higher powers of dialectics, higher speculation, higher thought over the last centuries. Because of war, because of the modern tools that we have discovered. So after Industrial Revolution and discovery of the sea routes. So can you imagine a man like Nagarjuna living in the 21st century? We may call him some kind of, if you read the teachings of some of the mid-19th century Russian radicalists, anarchists, their life also was equally anarchic. Remember, really speaking of the extreme liberal anarchist. Anarchism itself was a political ideology in mid-19th century in Russia, against the Tsar, against the king, against the system, everything. And they also, they were not very austere in their lifestyle. The opposite was correct. Dostoevsky himself was an anarchist. Most of the time he was fully drunk. Think of a man like Nagarjuna who is writing this extreme kind of dialectical masterpiece, Madhyamika Kariga. He was meditating every day, living a very humble, austere, meditative life, and writing this book. So that sometimes in modern times, when we read mere translations, when we don't read from a teacher, some kind of a guru tradition, we may miss that aspect frequently. That's the point. Really speaking. Give an example. If you read the Sermon on the Mount with a great reverence, veneration, reverence, sanctity, and you can also read it maybe in some kind of a beach with drinking Coca-Cola, read Sermon on the Mount. You can see two different ways of approaching the same holy teachings in a way. I'm giving one example from Western tradition, Gita, Upanishad, or anything like that. So these great men, and they were subject to idealism. So they were great saints and sages and scholars who dedicated an entire life for this speculative philosophy. But lifestyle was so austere, so self-denying, self-sacrificing life. So that's one important point to remember. Okay, yeah.
Thank you, Swami.
What I should mention, I'm sorry. See, so when they live like that, they get chitta suddhi. What Holy Mother said about the purity of mind that comes to you automatically when you practice unselfishness, compassion, austerity, dedication to a higher ideal. Then mind becomes pure. So Nagarjuna also belonged to that category. Pure minds, Holy Mother said, Okay, that's the idea. Okay?
Thank you.
Yeah.
If nobody else has more questions, I have another question.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
David, other than me, go ahead.
Okay. So the other question I have is, I'm just curious what your thoughts are, because you mentioned that there was freedom of thought, but they put Socrates to death.
Yeah. That's true, yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah, that's true. You're right, yeah, that's true. But Socrates, it was the state that did that. You're right, that's true. It was the state that did that. But Philo and Porphyry and this Neoplatonists in Plotinus, they were intact. That's true, you're right, that did happen in some. That happened in many places. In India also there were some cases where the great spiritual teachers had to face persecution. Even Ramanujacharya, living in South India, he was persecuted by a Shaiva king who belonged to the Shaiva school of devotional philosophy. So that happened, you are right. But still the independent thought and then philosophy taken as a search for ultimate truth, some kind of transcendental truth, that you find in Socrates, Plato, Plotinus, Democritus and all. But you don't find a theologian won't have that freedom. He has to adhere to the teachings of the revealed scriptures. And when again you put a cap on this, saying that if you do this, your eternal damnation is waiting for you, then philosophy actually will have a premature death in any such system. That's the idea.
So I guess even in a situation where there's freedom of thought, like in India or ancient Greece, even you have to be a little careful, like Ramanuja or
Yeah. But it was not very common, it was very rare. But not only Ramanuja and one of his followers also had to face problems from kings who believed in Shiva, for example. So one of them was Krimikala Chola. He was a king who had cancer on his neck. He was a king of the place who was responsible for persecuting. He did not actually persecute Ramanuja. Ramanuja actually fled from that place, went to a neighboring kingdom and took shelter there. But some of his followers were persecuted. Not in a genocidal manner, like not in that way, but he was asked to, you should accept that Shiva is greater than Vishnu. Vishnu was his god. So he sent a minister to Ramanuja. Ramanuja was asked, you should write here, Shiva is greater than Vishnu. But Ramanuja fled the place. And one of his followers impersonated. And he was caught. And he was forced to do this again. The story goes like that. So that's all. But that is very mild kind of persecution compared to what happens in many other places. That's all, yeah.
Thank you, Swami.
Thank you.
Thank you, David, reminding us that philosophy and poetry are not for the weak. Bravery is called for. Maharaj, I have a question about Augustine.
Yeah.
Because we tend to think of it as the faucet of a it's turned off. The valve is off, and then it raises the question, well, why was there not more resistance to this, even in the hierarchy of theology? And then I realized, sort of with like David did, that the context is a little more complicated.
Yeah.
There was resistance to it, especially in Russian Orthodox Church.
Yeah.
And Eastern Orthodoxy still to this day resists some of these Augustinian
True. Yeah.
dependencies.
Yeah.
So it's it's interesting that the dialectically speaking, it's never completely on or off, is it, in world history? These things swirl about, but there was a tendency in the West to surrender.
Excuse me, the last sentence, could you repeat once more?
I said there was a tendency in the West during the post-Augustinian era until Kant to surrender.
That's right.
Surrender philosophically, collapse in a way.
That's right. So there were so many mystics in Russian Orthodox Church. They were slightly fanatical in their emphasis on the finality of Christ, and they were, in fact, the Roman Catholic Church was much more adaptive and much more tolerant of non-Christian traditions than Russian Orthodox Church. But that kind of persecution didn't happen there, it seems. Burning at stake or calling to Rome and disrobing and excommunication didn't happen there. But one thing is, it seems to me, Augustine himself was a member of a prescribed organization before his conversion into Christianity. We call them monarchies or some kind of a Alexandrian sect of which he was a member, and then from there he converted into Christianity. So there was a complete transformation. He writes about this in his Confessions. Why did I take so long, oh God? He's addressing God. It's a very, very compelling classical work on these Confessions, So he was certainly a great spiritual teacher, no doubt about it. But frequently, as part of his ecclesiastical responsibilities, he had to bring in this idea of radical sinfulness. I don't know if Bible is in full agreement, the original Bible. If you read only the parables and teachings of Jesus Christ, if there is anything that can justify the idea of the radical sinfulness of man, which is a doctrine which emphasized by Augustine, which indirectly must have caused a lot of injustices within the Catholic Church itself. So his pre-Christian training as part of a slightly fanatical prescribed band organization, monarchies we call. And he gave it up and then he became a Christian, So that must have influenced his thoughts. So that's one way of looking at it. But still, there's a lot the City of God is a great spiritual classic. He's the equal of any of the greatest authors and teachers of the world in spiritual tradition. But it's only, but there is one thing, the inclusion of nature, external nature, phenomenal world, in the scheme of God's creation was not much accepted in the post-Augustinian theology. Look at the ancient Greek mystery religions which have influenced a lot of the speculative systems right up to Plotinus times. The nature, the beauty, the charm and all that. So again, there was this emphasis on one arbitrary man sitting above who decides, who does everything for you, who decides what should you do, where you should go after death. So that, of course, now that tradition is free from it, more or less, because the Christianity has got an inherent scope for self-enlightenment to come out of their own prison walls. That is the glory of Christianity. And Buddhism also, Hinduism, Judaism, Vedanta, all these traditions, Hinduism was never fanatical by any stretch of imagination. But you can find that tradition itself has got an inherent scope to come out of its own limitations. There is always a scope for a revival any day, any time. For example, we are discussing Vedanta today. We are not discussing Vedanta as, of course, essentially we are discussing the same Vedanta that Shankaracharya advocated. But the language is different. The metaphor is different. The emphasis is different. That's because of a man like Vivekananda. and is glorified as a champion of Vedanta. So without deviating from Shankara, still Shankara was given a new orientation by Vivekananda. Shankara's teachings are popular today thanks to Ramakrishna Mission Vivekananda, who popularized Advaita. So in Christianity also, from time to time, great saints were born. They reformed their convents like St. Teresa of Avila and others. So there was a lot of scope for some kind of inner or inherent self-refinement. A kind of like a new orientation, new emphasis. But some other tradition never had it, and you can see the problems all around us today. The religious traditions which do not allow any kind of reinterpretation, which still say that word written some 1400, 1500 years ago still is valid as such. There's always some difficulties. So Christianity is blissfully free from that. Judaism, Hinduism, Vedanta, Sikhism, Buddhism, all these traditions. So that's why you find so many contrary ideas in Hinduism. People say it's so chaotic. No, it is so wonderful. When there are so many different views and they argue among themselves, Nagarjuna, you find in Buddhist tradition, among the Sarvastivadins, Vaibhashikas and Sautrantikas, they quarrel among themselves. Both schools belong to Hinayana tradition, the Orthodox tradition. They are realists, then they reject each other, they cancel each other. So some people think absolute uniformity is a sign of spirituality. No, it's the opposite of it. Uniformity is okay in the military, not in religious and spirituality. Well, in spirituality and philosophy, there should be as many views as possible. That's the glory of Christianity, or Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, Vedanta. You can have a different view. Ramanuja can say something, Madhva something else. Okay, no problem. If you are angry with Shankara, Ramanuja will sit and write a book. That is way of expressing his anger to Shankara. That's what they did. If you're angry with another philosopher, you sit and write a book. That's all. That's a wonderful way of expressing your disagreement. That is the glory of Hinduism and Vedanta. Okay. So thank you for the question. Yeah.
Thank you, Maharaj. You can't see it, but there are thumbs up reactions on the Zoom chat. So this is very appealing. Thank you, Maharaj.
Thank you. So we'll conclude now. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Sri Ram Krishna Arpanamastu.
Thank you, Maharaj.
Thank you.